The ground crew chief stared at the twisted metal in his hands and felt his stomach drop. Inside the wreckage of the Soviet IL-2 Sturmovik they'd just pulled apart, German engineers had discovered something that made every previous assumption about ground attack aircraft completely obsolete. This wasn't just advanced engineering. This was a fundamental rethinking of how planes could survive the most dangerous mission in aviation. And the Luftwaffe had been building their attack aircraft entirely wrong. December 1942, Eastern Front, near Stalingrad. The frozen steppe stretched endlessly in every direction. A white hell where temperatures dropped to 30 below and men died as often from the cold as from enemy fire. The Wehrmacht was locked in brutal combat for every ruined building, every street, every room in a city that had become a symbol neither side could afford to lose. Above this frozen battlefield, Soviet IL-2 Sturmoviks prowled like armored predators, diving low to strafe German positions with cannon fire and rockets that turned armored vehicles into burning coffins. The IL-2 had earned a reputation that bordered on mythical. Soviet pilots called it the flying tank. German soldiers had a different name for it, Der Schwarzer Tod, the Black Death. The aircraft appeared without warning, flying so low that its shadow crossed the ground just seconds before its guns opened fire. It absorbed punishment that would tear apart any other plane. German gunners watched their rounds strike home, certain they'd scored killing hits, only to see the Sturmovik continue its attack run as if nothing had happened. Oberst Heinrich Weiss commanded a Luftwaffe technical intelligence unit tasked with examining captured enemy equipment. He'd analyzed dozens of Soviet aircraft, from nimble Yak fighters to lumbering PE-2 bombers. But the IL-2 had always eluded him. The Soviets were fanatical about denying the Germans intact examples. Downed Sturmoviks were either completely destroyed on impact or were swiftly demolished by Soviet recovery teams who reached the wreckage first. In 2 years of war, Weiss had never gotten his hands on a complete airframe. That changed on a bitter morning when his phone rang at 0400. A forward reconnaissance unit had spotted an IL-2 down in no man's land, approximately 3 kilometers from German lines. The aircraft appeared largely intact. The area was under sporadic artillery fire from both sides, making recovery dangerous. But the opportunity was too valuable to ignore. Weiss assembled a team within the hour, 8 men, 2 vehicles. They moved out before dawn, navigating shell-cratered roads that had been reduced to frozen mud and broken ice. The landscape was apocalyptic. Burned-out tanks sat like monuments to futility. Entire villages had been erased, leaving only foundations and chimneys pointing at the gray sky like accusing fingers. Bodies lay frozen in the positions where they'd fallen, some half-buried in snow, others standing upright where they had died, frozen solid before they could collapse. The IL-2 sat in a field 200 meters from a destroyed collective farm. The aircraft had bellied in, its landing gear either retracted or torn away. The wings showed multiple hit markers, dark punctures where German guns had found their target. The canopy was shattered, but the overall structure remained surprisingly intact. The pilot's body was slumped forward in the cockpit, frozen at his controls, his face hidden by his leather helmet. Weiss approached cautiously. Soviet patrols operated in this area, and the wreckage could be booby-trapped. His men spread out, establishing a defensive perimeter, while 2 engineers began the initial examination. They confirmed what Weiss had suspected. This wasn't a normal crash. The aircraft had been forced down by accumulated damage, but had maintained enough control for a controlled landing. The pilot had stayed with his machine until the end. They worked quickly. The technical team photographed every detail, documenting the airframe from every angle before they began disassembly. Soviet artillery opened up to the north, the distant crump of impacts reminding them that time was not their friend. They removed the canopy, carefully extracted the pilot's frozen body, and began the methodical process of exposing the aircraft's internal structure. What they found in the first 10 minutes made Weiss call for additional support. The IL-2 wasn't just armored. The entire forward fuselage, from the engine to the rear of the cockpit, was a single armored shell. Not plates bolted to a conventional frame, not protective shielding added as an afterthought. The armor was integral to the structure itself. The bathtub, as Weiss immediately thought of it, served as both protection and primary airframe component. The steel plating ranged from 5 mm to 12 mm thick, designed to deflect or absorb ground fire from every angle. German attack aircraft used armor too, but as supplemental protection. Removable plates. Weight that could be adjusted based on mission requirements. The IL-2 had abandoned that philosophy entirely. The armor was the airplane. Remove it, and the aircraft couldn't fly because there'd be no structure left to hold it together. Weiss ran his hand along the inner surface of the armor plating. He could see where German rounds had struck. Dozens of impact, 20mm cannon shells that should have torn through the fuselage had instead left dense, deep gouges, but no penetration. The few rounds that had punched through had struck at oblique angles where the armor was thinnest, and even then the penetrators had fragmented against the backing structure rather than continuing into vital components. The engineering team worked through the morning, carefully mapping every system. The oil cooler was armored. The coolant system had redundant lines protected by steel sheathing. The fuel tanks were self-sealing, constructed with multiple layers of rubber that would swell and close when punctured. Even the control cables had armor channeling to prevent a single lucky hit from severing the pilot's connection to the control surfaces. But it was the engine installation that made Weiss stop and stare in genuine admiration. The Mikulin AM-38 engine sat in a mounting that seemed designed by someone who understood that ground attack aircraft would be hit and had planned accordingly. The engine itself was positioned to serve as an armored shield, protecting the cockpit from frontal fire. But beyond that, the mounting allowed the engine to absorb tremendous damage and keep running. Coolant lines could be severed, and the engine would continue operating long enough for the pilot to egress the combat area. Oil pressure could drop to levels that would seize a German engine, and the AM-38 would keep turning. One of the engineers, a former Messerschmitt technician named Gruber, shook his head slowly as he examined the engine mounts. The tolerances are incredible. This engine is built to run rough, run damaged, run beyond any parameter we'd consider acceptable, and still get the pilot home. It's not elegant, it's not efficient by our standards, but for this mission, it's perfect. Weiss understood immediately what the Soviets had done. They'd started with the mission requirements and worked backward. A ground attack aircraft would be hit. That wasn't a possibility, it was a certainty. The question wasn't how to avoid damage, but how to survive it. Every design choice in the IL-2 reflected that philosophy. Armor first, survivability first, everything else was secondary. German doctrine approached the problem differently. The Luftwaffe emphasized speed and firepower, relying on the pilot's skill and the aircraft's agility to avoid the worst of the ground fire. Armor was added where weight allowed, but the fundamental airframe remained a conventional structure with protection bolted on. The Ju-87 Stuka, the Luftwaffe's primary ground attack platform, could be devastated by a single well-placed burst of machine gun fire. The afternoon brought complications. Soviet artillery intensified, walking closer to their position. Weiss made the decision to accelerate the recovery. They couldn't complete a full analysis in the field, but they could remove the critical components: the armored bathtub, the engine, the control systems, enough to understand what made the IL-2 so devastatingly effective. The recovery vehicles arrived an hour before sunset. Using cables and a portable crane, they extracted the armored shell from the airframe. It took 6 men to maneuver the section onto the truck bed. The weight was staggering. Weiss did quick mental calculations and realized that the armor alone accounted for nearly a third of the aircraft's total weight. The Soviets had committed to protection at a level that would have been considered unacceptable by Luftwaffe standards, where every kilogram was scrutinized for its impact on performance. They loaded what they could and abandoned the rest. Soviet patrols were moving in their direction, drawn by the activity. The convoy pulled out just as the first mortar rounds began impacting near the crash site. Weiss watched through the rear window as the remains of the IL-2 disappeared into the gathering darkness, left behind for the Soviets to recover or destroy. Back at the technical facility, the real analysis began. Weiss assembled a team of engineers, metallurgists, and combat pilots. They spent 3 days examining every centimeter of the recovered components. The armor composition was analyzed, the welding techniques were studied, the structural integration was mapped and documented. What emerged was a picture of an aircraft designed with a ruthless focus on a single mission profile. The IL-2 was not a fighter. In air-to-air combat, it was vulnerable, slow, and limited in maneuverability. But for ground attack, for flying low and slow over enemy positions while absorbing withering defensive fire, it was without peer. The armor didn't just protect the pilot, it protected the engine, the cooling systems, the control mechanisms, everything required to keep the aircraft flying long enough to complete its attack and return to base. A Luftwaffe test pilot named Hartmann, who'd flown everything from Bf-109 fighters to Ju-88 bombers, examined the cockpit layout and the control systems with growing respect. They've eliminated everything that isn't essential. No luxury, no comfort. The pilot sits in an armored box with exactly what he needs to fly and fight, nothing more. It's crude compared to our aircraft, but for the mission, it's exactly right. The findings went up the chain of command. Weiss compiled a comprehensive report detailing the IL-2's design philosophy and recommending immediate changes to Luftwaffe ground attack doctrine and aircraft design. The report reached Göring's staff within a week. The response was predictable and disappointing. German industry was already operating at maximum capacity. Retooling to produce an entirely new class of armored ground attack aircraft would require resources that didn't exist. The Ju-87 Stuka remained in production despite its increasing vulnerability because the factories were set up for it, and changing would cause months of disruption. The war couldn't wait for perfect solutions. But the report did have an impact. Modifications were made to existing aircraft. Additional armor was added to Stukas and FW-190 fighter bombers, though never to the integrated level of the IL-2. Tactics changed. German pilots were instructed to attack from higher altitudes when possible, to minimize exposure to ground fire. Recovery procedures improved, with damaged aircraft given priority for salvage and repair. More significantly, the IL-2 analysis influenced post-war thinking. When aviation engineers began designing the next generation of ground attack aircraft, the lessons learned from that frozen morning in December 1942 informed every decision. The American A-10 Thunderbolt II, developed 3 decades later, embodied many of the same principles. Armor integrated into the structure, redundant systems, an engine designed to run while damaged. The titanium bathtub protecting the cockpit was a direct philosophical descendant of the IL-2's armored shell. Weiss never stopped thinking about that aircraft. Years later, long after the war had ended and he'd returned to civilian life, he would describe the IL-2 examination as a turning point in his understanding of military aviation. "We were building aircraft for the war we wanted to fight," he'd say. "The Soviets built aircraft for the war that actually existed. They understood that their pilots would face impossible odds, that they'd be hit repeatedly, and they designed accordingly. It wasn't pretty. It wasn't sophisticated by Western standards, but it worked." The numbers supported that assessment. The Soviet Union produced over 36,000 IL-2 Sturmoviks during the war, more than any other military aircraft in history. Loss rates were high, but survivability was far better than comparable aircraft from other nations. German soldiers learned to fear the sound of the IL-2's approach, that distinctive engine note that signaled incoming devastation. Tank crews would abandon their vehicles at the first sign of Sturmoviks, knowing that armor which could deflect anti-tank rounds offered little protection against rockets and cannon fire from above. The IL-2 wasn't invincible. Determined fighter pilots could shoot them down. Concentrated anti-aircraft fire could overwhelm even the heaviest armor, but the aircraft could absorb damage that would destroy anything else flying and keep fighting. That resilience, that brutal practicality, made it one of the most effective weapons of the Eastern Front. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The technical intelligence gleaned from that single downed aircraft rippled through Luftwaffe planning for the remainder of the war. Weiss's report became required reading for attack aircraft pilots. Training emphasized survivability over glory. Mission planning accounted for the reality that aircraft would be damaged and needed to make it home. Maintenance crews developed procedures for field repairs that could get a damaged aircraft flying again, even with significant battle damage. The psychological impact was equally significant. German soldiers had always known the Soviets were willing to accept casualties that would be unthinkable in Western armies. The IL-2 demonstrated that this philosophy extended to equipment design. The Soviets would build a plane that was crude by German standards, inefficient, heavy, and limited in capability, but perfect for its intended role. They'd build it by the thousands, crew it with pilots who had minimal training, and throw it into combat with the understanding that losses would be severe, but the mission would succeed. That approach terrified German commanders who were accustomed to emphasizing quality over quantity, individual skill over mass action. The IL-2 represented a different calculus entirely. It didn't matter if you shot down 50 Sturmoviks if 100 more appeared the next day. It didn't matter if your tanks had better armor and more powerful guns if those tanks were burning wrecks before they could engage. The Eastern Front was teaching harsh lessons about the mathematics of industrial warfare, and the IL-2 was one of the clearest examples. Weiss tracked IL-2 development throughout the war. Intelligence reports detailed improvements to the design. Later models added a rear gunner position, reducing vulnerability to fighter attack from behind. Engine power increased, weapon loads expanded, but the fundamental concept never changed. The armored bathtub, the protected systems, the philosophy that the aircraft would be hit and must survive anyway. German attempts to develop a comparable aircraft never achieved the same success. The Henschel HS-129 was designed as an armored ground attack platform, but production numbers remained limited, and the aircraft never achieved the same battlefield impact as the IL-2. The FW-190F and G variants served effectively as fighter bombers, but lacked the integrated armor protection that made the Sturmovik so resilient. By the time German designers fully appreciated what the Soviets had accomplished, the industrial capacity to respond no longer existed. The winter of 1944 brought the war full circle. Soviet forces pushed westward, driving toward Berlin. IL-2 squadrons ranged over German territory, attacking the same kind of targets they'd defended years earlier. German soldiers on the receiving end of Sturmovik attacks understood exactly what their Soviet counterparts had endured. The rockets, the cannon fire, the relentless pressure from aircraft that seemed impossible to stop. Weiss spent the final months of the war in Bavaria, far from the front lines, working on projects that would never be completed. The technical facilities where he'd analyzed the IL-2 had been evacuated, the equipment scattered or destroyed to prevent capture. The reports he'd written, the analyses he'd compiled, were packed into crates and shipped to locations that may or may not have survived the final Soviet advance. When the war ended, Weiss surrendered to American forces. During his interrogation, he spoke extensively about Soviet aviation technology. The Americans were intensely interested in the IL-2, having seen the aircraft in action during joint operations with Soviet forces. Weiss provided detailed briefings based on his examination of the captured Sturmovik, insights that would inform American ground attack aircraft development for decades. He was always careful to emphasize one point above all others. The IL-2 wasn't just an aircraft, it was a philosophy made tangible. The Soviets understood what ground attack required and built accordingly. They accepted limitations that would have been unacceptable to Western designers. They committed to protection at a level that seemed excessive until you saw the results, and they produced them in numbers that made individual losses irrelevant to the overall strategic impact. In the decades after the war, aviation museums around the world acquired IL-2 Sturmoviks for their collections. Weiss visited several of these museums when health permitted. He'd stand in front of the restored aircraft, remembering that frozen December morning when he'd first seen the armored bathtub and understood what it represented. Visitors would pass by, often without giving the Soviet attack plane more than a glance, drawn instead to the sleeker fighters and heavy bombers that dominated the display halls. Weiss knew better. That ungainly, brutal aircraft had changed ground attack warfare forever. It had demonstrated that survivability could be designed into an airframe from the beginning, rather than added as an afterthought. It had proven that accepting limitations in some areas to achieve dominance in others was a valid design philosophy. And it had killed thousands of German soldiers who'd learned too late that armor designed to stop tanks offered no protection against a Sturmovik attack. The technical drawings Weiss had made in 1942 survived the war in American archives. Decades later, when the A-10 Thunderbolt II was being designed, engineers studied those drawings. They examined the IL-2's armor integration, its redundant systems, its engine protection, the A-10's titanium bathtub, its separated engines, its ability to fly with massive damage, all reflected lessons first learned from examining a downed Sturmovik on the frozen steppe. Weiss died in 1978, having lived long enough to see the A-10 enter service. Friends said he smiled when he first saw photographs of the American attack aircraft, recognizing the design philosophy he'd first encountered 36 years earlier in the wreckage of an enemy plane. "The bathtub lives on," he reportedly said. They finally understood. The IL-2 story became one of the great case studies in military aviation design. Universities teaching aerospace engineering used it as an example of mission-focused development. Military strategists examined it when discussing the relationship between quantity and quality in weapons procurement. Historians pointed to it as evidence of Soviet industrial capacity and design innovation during the war. But for the men who'd faced it in combat, the IL-2 was simpler than that. It was the Black Death. It was the sound of approaching engines that meant take cover or die. It was the aircraft that kept coming no matter how many rounds you fired at it. It was the proof that the Soviets could build weapons as effective as anything the Germans fielded, just different in philosophy and execution. The German soldiers who'd called in reports of Sturmovik attacks, describing aircraft that absorbed incredible damage and continued fighting, hadn't been exaggerating. The technical analysis confirmed what they'd seen. The IL-2 was designed to survive. Everything else was secondary to that goal. The Soviets had built an aircraft that matched their tactical doctrine, their industrial capacity, and their willingness to accept casualties that would horrify other nations. Years after the war, a German veteran who'd fought at Stalingrad was interviewed about his experiences. When asked what he remembered most vividly, he didn't talk about the cold, the hunger, or the house-to-house fighting. He talked about the IL-2s, You'd hear them coming, he said, that engine sound, and you knew you had maybe 30 seconds to find cover. If you were in a vehicle, you'd bail out and run. The tanks, the trucks, none of it mattered if the Sturmoviks found you. They'd come in low, maybe 50 meters off the ground, and they'd just tear everything apart. We'd shoot at them, we'd hit them, we could see the strikes, and they'd just keep coming. That was the genius of the IL-2. It was designed for the reality of ground attack warfare rather than an idealized version of it. The Soviets knew their aircraft would be hit. They knew losses would be severe. So they built a plane that could take the hits and still complete the mission. They armored it beyond what Western designers thought reasonable. They simplified the systems to increase reliability. They accepted reduced performance in areas like speed and maneuverability to gain superiority in survivability. The examination of that single downed aircraft in December 1942 revealed all of this to German intelligence. The reports Weiss filed should have triggered an immediate redesign of Luftwaffe ground attack aircraft, but the industrial reality of total war made that impossible. Germany couldn't retool its factories, couldn't divert resources from existing programs, couldn't afford the months of disruption that a fundamental design change would require. So the Luftwaffe continued flying aircraft that were increasingly vulnerable to ground fire, while Soviet Sturmoviks ranged across the battlefield with relative impunity. The tactical advantage this provided the Soviets was immeasurable. German armor, which had dominated the early war through superior tactics and vehicle design, became vulnerable from a threat dimension it couldn't effectively counter. You could armor a tank against anti-tank guns, but you couldn't armor the top surface enough to stop rockets from above. The IL-2 attacks forced German forces to disperse, to avoid concentration, to move primarily at night, when air attack was less likely. This degraded combat effectiveness across the board. Units that should have been massing for offensive operations instead spread out to minimize losses to air attack. Supply columns traveled in small groups rather than efficient convoys. Artillery positions changed location constantly to avoid being targeted by Sturmoviks that could loiter over the battlefield, hunting for targets. All of this stemmed from a design philosophy that Weiss had documented in detail after examining the downed aircraft. The Soviets had built a weapon system optimized for a specific mission profile and deployed it in numbers that made it strategically decisive. The Germans had studied it, understood it, and ultimately couldn't counter it because their industrial base was already committed to different design approaches. In the final accounting, the IL-2 represented more than just an effective ground attack aircraft. It demonstrated that the Soviets could innovate, could design weapons that matched or exceeded German equipment in specific roles, and could deploy those weapons at a scale that overwhelmed tactical advantages. The flying tank earned its reputation through brutal effectiveness, surviving damage that would destroy other aircraft and inflicting losses that shaped the entire Eastern Front campaign. The ground crew chief who'd first pulled apart that wreckage, who'd stared at the armored bathtub and understood what it meant, had been exactly right to feel his stomach drop. What they'd found had changed ground attack warfare forever. The Soviets had demonstrated a better way to build aircraft for the most dangerous mission in aviation, and the Luftwaffe, despite understanding the lesson, never managed to match it. That frozen December morning in 1942, in a field near Stalingrad, German engineers documented the future of ground attack aviation. The IL-2 Sturmovik, crude and heavy and brutally effective, had shown them what survivability looked like when it was the primary design goal rather than an afterthought. Decades later, that lesson still resonated in every armored attack aircraft that took to the sky, carrying forward the philosophy first revealed in the wreckage of the Black Death. The intelligence breakthrough that came from examining the IL-2 created ripples that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Weiss's report landed on desks throughout the Luftwaffe command structure, and each reader came away with the same unsettling conclusion. The Soviets weren't just building more aircraft, they were building better aircraft for specific roles. The assumption that German engineering superiority would carry the day was crumbling under the weight of evidence. General Feldmarschall Wolfram von Richthofen, cousin of the legendary Red Baron and commander of Luftflotte 4, read Weiss's analysis with growing concern. Von Richthofen had spent his career in close air support operations, from the Spanish Civil War through the campaigns in Poland and France. He understood ground attack doctrine as well as anyone in the Luftwaffe, and he recognized immediately that the IL-2 represented a fundamental challenge to German air superiority. Von Richthofen called a conference in early January 1943. Senior officers from across the Eastern Front gathered at a commandeered school building in Ukraine. The heat barely worked. Ice formed on the inside of the windows. But the men who assembled in that freezing room represented the accumulated expertise of the Luftwaffe's ground attack forces. They'd flown thousands of missions, they'd lost hundreds of aircraft and pilots, and they were losing the battle of attrition to an enemy they'd been told was technologically inferior. Weiss presented his findings to the assembled officers. He'd brought photographs of the IL-2's armored structure, metallurgical analysis of the armor plating, and detailed drawings showing how the protection was integrated into the airframe. The room fell silent as he walked them through the implications. Every Stuka pilot in that room had experienced the sickening feeling of ground fire tearing through their aircraft. They'd seen friends go down to defensive fire that should have been survivable. Now they were looking at an enemy aircraft designed from the beginning to survive exactly that kind of punishment. A Hauptmann named Rudel, already legendary for his tank-killing abilities in the Stuka, asked the question everyone was thinking. Can we build something similar? Can we get this level of protection into our own aircraft? Weiss answered honestly. Technically, yes. We understand the principles now. We know how the Soviets achieved this integration of armor and structure. But practically, the answer is no. Our factories are tooled for the aircraft we're currently producing. Retooling would take months we don't have and resources we can't spare. The best we can do is modify existing designs and adjust our tactics. The conference spent 2 days developing new tactical doctrine based on the IL-2 analysis. German ground attack aircraft would operate in larger formations, providing mutual support against Soviet fighters. Attack altitudes would increase, trading accuracy for survivability. Mission planning would emphasize hitting targets where Soviet air defenses were weakest, rather than accepting heavy losses to strike hardened positions. But everyone in that room knew they were applying bandages to a hemorrhage. The fundamental problem remained. The Soviets could afford to lose IL-2s at rates that would ground the Luftwaffe. Soviet production was measured in thousands of aircraft per month. German production struggled to replace losses. Every downed Stuka represented a gap in capability that might not be filled for weeks. Every dead pilot was a loss of irreplaceable experience and training. The mathematics of attrition warfare were brutally simple. The Soviets didn't need to achieve air superiority in the traditionals. They just needed to maintain enough pressure that German ground forces couldn't operate effectively. The IL-2 provided that pressure. It forced dispersion. It denied concentration. It made movement dangerous and static positions vulnerable. The aircraft itself became a strategic weapon through sheer persistence. Weiss returned to his technical facility after the conference with a new assignment. Von Richthofen wanted a comprehensive study of Soviet aviation technology, not just the IL-2, but everything. Fighters, bombers, reconnaissance aircraft. What were the Soviets doing differently? What design philosophies were they employing? Where were German assumptions leading them astray? The work consumed the next year of Weiss's life. His team examined every piece of Soviet equipment they could acquire. Crashed aircraft were recovered under fire. Defectors were interviewed about production methods and design priorities. Intelligence reports from occupied territories provided glimpses into Soviet aviation factory. A picture emerged that challenged fundamental German assumptions about technological development. The Soviets weren't trying to build the best aircraft in every category. They were building good enough aircraft that could be produced in enormous quantities. They simplified where possible. They accepted limitations that German engineers would consider unacceptable, but they optimized ruthlessly for their specific operational environment. Aircraft designed for the Eastern Front didn't need long range because the front lines were relatively static. They didn't need high-altitude performance because most combat occurred below 5,000 meters. They needed reliability, ease of maintenance, and survivability. The IL-2 embodied this philosophy perfectly. It wasn't the fastest ground attack aircraft. It wasn't the most maneuverable. It certainly wasn't the most comfortable for the pilot, but it was the most survivable, and it could be produced at a rate that made losses acceptable. Soviet factories turned out Sturmoviks in assembly lines that ran around the clock. Workers who'd never seen an aircraft before were trained in weeks to perform specific tasks. The production system was designed for speed and volume rather than precision and quality. This realization forced Weiss to confront an uncomfortable truth. German aviation had been designed by engineers who prized elegance and efficiency. Soviet aviation was designed by pragmatists who prized results and volume. In a war of attrition, the pragmatists were winning. The Yak-9 fighter that Weiss examined in spring 1943 reinforced this conclusion. The aircraft was crude compared to a Bf-109. The finish was rough, the cockpit was Spartan, control harmonization was poor, but it was fast enough, maneuverable enough, and armed well enough to challenge German fighters. More importantly, Soviet factories were building them by the hundreds, while German production struggled with increasingly complex designs that required skilled labor and precision manufacturing. A metallurgist on Weiss's team named Fischer made an observation that stuck with everyone who heard it. The Soviets are building war-winning aircraft. We're building aircraft-winning wars. There's a difference. They've accepted that individual aircraft will be inferior to ours in many respects, but they're fielding enough of them that it doesn't matter. We're still trying to build the perfect fighter, the perfect bomber, the perfect ground attack aircraft. By the time we perfect the design, the war has moved on. This insight spread through German technical intelligence circles. Reports began emphasizing Soviet production capacity as much as individual aircraft capabilities. Estimates of Soviet aviation strength were revised upward repeatedly as the true scale of their manufacturing became apparent. The numbers were staggering. The Soviet Union was outproducing Germany in military aircraft by ratios that approached 3 or 4 to 1. If these memories of sacrifice resonate with you, please consider liking this video, leaving a comment with your thoughts, and subscribing to ensure these stories are never forgotten. The strategic implications were devastating. Germany was fighting a multi-front war with finite resources. Every aircraft sent to defend the Reich from Allied bombing was one less aircraft available for the Eastern Front. Every experienced pilot killed over Germany or the Mediterranean was a loss that couldn't be easily replaced. The Luftwaffe was being ground down by simple arithmetic. The IL-2 continued to evolve throughout 1943 and 1944. Weiss tracked each modification through intelligence reports and examination of newly downed aircraft. The addition of the rear gunner position addressed one of the Sturmovik's few vulnerabilities. German fighters had learned to attack from behind and below, an angle the original IL-2 couldn't defend. The two-seat version eliminated that blind spot. Engine power increased with new variant. The AM-38F engine produced significantly more horsepower than the original, improving speed and climb rate without sacrificing the legendary reliability. Weapon loads expanded. Early IL-2s carried two 23mm cannons and light bombs. Later versions mounted 37mm cannons capable of penetrating tank armor from above and could carry rockets, bombs, and even aerial torpedoes for anti-shipping missions. But the core philosophy never changed. Protection first. Survivability first. Every other consideration remained secondary to getting the pilot home alive. This consistency of vision impressed Weiss even as he worked to counter its effects. The Soviets had identified what they needed and stuck with it, refining and improving rather than constantly chasing the next revolutionary design. German ground attack development, by contrast, lurched from concept to concept. The HS-129 was underpowered and difficult to maintain. The HS-132 jet ground attack aircraft never made it past prototype stage. Various modifications to existing fighters and bombers created aircraft that could perform ground attack missions, but were compromises rather than purpose-built platforms. Nothing matched the IL-2's focused dedication to a single mission profile. By 1944, the tactical situation had deteriorated to the point where Luftwaffe ground attack missions became increasingly dangerous regardless of aircraft type. Soviet air defenses had improved dramatically. Anti-aircraft guns deployed in depth made low-altitude attacks suicidal. Soviet fighters swarmed over the battlefield in numbers that overwhelmed German escorts. The loss rates that had been acceptable in 1941 and 1942 became catastrophic. Weiss watched as the pilots who'd attended that freezing conference in January 1943 were killed one by one. Rudel survived through a combination of skill and luck that defied probability, but he was the exception. Most ground attack pilots lasted weeks or months before being killed or wounded. The replacement pilots arrived with minimal training, forced into combat before they'd mastered basic flight skills. The quality gap between German and Soviet pilots, once heavily in Germany's favor, had narrowed to insignificance. The IL-2 regiments, meanwhile, continued their relentless pressure. Soviet tactics evolved to maximize the Sturmovik's strengths while minimizing exposure to its weaknesses. Attacks came in waves, with fighters suppressing anti-aircraft positions while the IL-2s made their runs. Coordination improved. Communication between ground forces and air units became more effective. The individual Soviet pilot might still lack the training and experience of his German counterpart, but the system supporting him was becoming increasingly sophisticated. Weiss documented all of this in reports that grew progressively more pessimistic. The technical analysis remained sharp and professional, but the strategic conclusions were unavoidable. The Luftwaffe was losing the battle for the Eastern Front. Soviet aviation had achieved a level of capability that matched or exceeded German forces in most respects and overwhelmed them through sheer numbers. The final year of the war brought the consequences of these trends into sharp focus. Operation Bagration, the Soviet summer offensive of 1944, demonstrated what happened when the Red Air Force achieved local air superiority. IL-2 regiments ranged across the battlefield unopposed, destroying German armor and artillery at will. Wehrmacht units that had survived years of combat were annihilated in days by the combined pressure of Soviet ground forces and overwhelming air attack. Weiss was in Berlin by this point, his technical facility having been evacuated westward ahead of the Soviet advance. He spent his days analyzing intelligence reports and writing assessments that fewer and fewer people had time to read. The war had moved beyond the point where technical intelligence could change outcomes. The questions weren't about how to counter Soviet aircraft anymore, but about how to survive the next week. But Weiss continued his work with the same meticulous attention to detail he'd always employed. The IL-2 remained his primary focus. He'd been studying the aircraft for over 2 years now, and his understanding had deepened from technical appreciation to something approaching professional respect. The Soviets had built exactly what they needed. They'd identified the mission requirements, designed accordingly, and produced the aircraft in quantities that made it strategically decisive. It was a masterclass in focused weapons development. When Berlin fell in May 1945, Weiss was in Bavaria, having evacuated south with what remained of his technical staff. The Americans who captured him were professional and courteous. They'd been briefed that technical intelligence personnel were valuable sources of information about Soviet capabilities. Weiss was transported to a facility where he spent weeks being debriefed about everything he'd learned. The American officers were particularly interested in the IL-2. Their own ground attack aircraft, primarily P-47 Thunderbolts adapted for the role, had performed adequately but lacked the dedicated design focus of the Sturmovik. The Americans were beginning to think about future conflicts and what aircraft they'd need. Weiss's analysis provided invaluable insights. He explained the armor integration in detail, drawing diagrams from memory when his original documents weren't available. He described the Soviet design philosophy, the emphasis on survivability over performance. He walked them through the tactical evolution he'd observed, how the IL-2 regiments had become increasingly effective as Soviet operational art improved. The Americans took notes and asked intelligent questions. One American colonel, an aviator who'd flown combat missions over Europe, asked Weiss a question that cut to the heart of the matter. If you were designing a ground attack aircraft today, knowing everything you've learned, what would you build? Weiss thought carefully before answering. I'd build the IL-2, not a copy, but something that embodied the same philosophy.
Armor integrated into the structure, not added as an afterthought. Redundant system, an engine designed to run while damaged, heavy armament, and I'd accept the limitations that come with those choices. It won't be fast, it won't be elegant.
But it will bring the pilot home, and that's what matters most. The colonel nodded slowly. That's what I needed to hear. We've been arguing about this very question. Some of our people want speed and maneuverability, but I flew enough missions to know that ground attack is about surviving long enough to deliver your weapons and get out. Thank you. Years later, Weiss would wonder if that conversation had influenced the eventual development of the A-10. The timeline suggested it might have. American close air support doctrine evolved significantly in the post-war period, moving away from adapted fighters toward purpose-built platforms. The philosophy he'd identified in the IL-2, survivability as the primary design driver, eventually found expression in American aviation. But that was decades in the future. In the immediate post-war period, Weiss worked with the Americans to document Soviet aviation technology comprehensively. His reports formed the foundation of Western understanding of Soviet aircraft design for years. The IL-2 analysis remained the centerpiece, the example that demonstrated Soviet capabilities most clearly. Weiss eventually returned to civilian life, taking a position with an aviation firm that designed commercial aircraft. The work was different from military aviation, but the fundamental principles remained the same. Understand the mission requirements, design accordingly, accept necessary limitations to achieve superior performance in critical areas. The lessons he'd learned studying the IL-2 informed every project he touched. He never forgot that frozen morning in December 1942. The moment when he'd first understood what the Soviets had accomplished remained vivid decades later. The armored bathtub, crude and heavy and absolutely brilliant in its focused purpose. The engineering team working frantically to document everything before Soviet patrols arrived. The growing realization that this aircraft represented a threat the Luftwaffe couldn't effectively counter. Veterans of the Eastern Front would sometimes contact Weiss, having learned of his expertise. They wanted to talk about the IL-2, to share their experiences of being attacked by aircraft that seemed impossible to stop. Weiss listened to these stories with the respect they deserved. These men had faced the Black Death in combat. They'd survived what thousands of others hadn't. Their testimony validated everything his technical analysis had concluded. One veteran, a former tank commander, described an attack that perfectly illustrated the IL-2's capabilities. His Panther tank had been hit by rockets that penetrated the thin top armor. He'd escaped, but watched from a ditch as the Sturmovik circled back for another pass despite visible damage from defensive fire. The IL-2 made 3 more attack runs, destroying 2 additional tanks before finally departing. The tank commander had counted at least 15 hits on the Soviet aircraft. It flew away, trailing smoke but still under control. That was the IL-2 in essence, an aircraft that could absorb punishment, that would doom anything else and still complete its mission. The Soviets had built it specifically for that purpose, and they'd succeeded beyond what Western designers thought possible. The armored bathtub had protected the pilot. The redundant systems had kept the aircraft flying. The design philosophy had proven itself in the crucible of combat. Weiss died knowing that the lessons he'd documented had influenced aviation design for generations. The IL-2 hadn't just been an effective weapon, it had been a demonstration of what focused, mission-driven design could achieve. Build for the mission you'll actually fly, not the mission you wish you were flying. Protect what matters most. Accept limitations in areas that don't determine survival. Those principles, first revealed in the wreckage of a downed Sturmovik, echoed through every armored ground attack aircraft that followed. The frozen field where German engineers had first opened up the IL-2 is farmland again now. Nothing marks the location where one of the war's most significant technical intelligence discoveries occurred. But the impact of what was learned there reverberates still, in every A-10 that flies close air support missions, in every design decision that prioritizes pilot survivability over raw performance. The Black Death left a legacy that transcended the war that created it, teaching lessons that would save lives for generations to come. The intelligence network that Weiss had built around Soviet aviation technology continued operating even as the strategic situation collapsed. Throughout 1944, his team collected fragments of information from across the Eastern Front. Each crashed aircraft, each defector interview, each reconnaissance photograph added another piece to an increasingly troubling picture. The Soviets weren't just maintaining their aviation capability, they were accelerating development at a pace that left German efforts far behind. A report crossed Weiss's desk in August 1944 that forced him to fundamentally reassess Soviet intention. An IL-2 had been shot down near Warsaw, carrying experimental weaponry that suggested the Soviets were thinking far beyond the current conflict. The aircraft mounted a prototype 37mm cannon with sub-caliber penetrators designed specifically to defeat the frontal armor of Tiger and Panther tanks. This wasn't incremental improvement. This was the Soviets anticipating future armor developments and designing weapons to counter them before they became widespread. The implications were staggering. German intelligence had operated under the assumption that Soviet design bureaus were reactive, responding to German innovations rather than anticipating them. This report suggested otherwise. The Soviets were conducting their own analysis of armor development trends and creating weapon systems to address future threats. They were thinking strategically about the technological competition in ways that matched or exceeded German efforts. Weiss convened his senior analysts to examine this new evidence. The group included specialists in armor, aviation weaponry, and Soviet industrial capacity. They spent 3 days picking apart every detail of the captured cannon system. The metallurgy was sophisticated. The ammunition design showed understanding of advanced penetrator physics. The mounting system integrated seamlessly with the IL-2 airframe, suggesting it had been planned from early in the aircraft's development rather than added later. Fisher, the metallurgist who'd made the observation about war-winning aircraft, examined the cannon barrel with obvious admiration. This isn't crude Soviet manufacturing. This is precision engineering at a level comparable to anything we're producing. They've solved the same technical problems we're working on, and they've done it while producing thousands of aircraft per month. We need to stop underestimating them. The discussion turned to strategic implications. If the Soviets were developing weapons to counter German armor that didn't yet exist in large numbers, what else were they anticipating? Were they developing jet aircraft to counter the Me-262? Were they working on guided weapons to address the increasing effectiveness of German anti-aircraft defenses? The assumption that the Red Air Force was a blunt instrument wielded through mass rather than sophistication was crumbling. Weiss drafted a report that would prove to be one of his most prescient. He argued that Soviet aviation had transitioned from quantitative superiority to qualitative equivalence with the Luftwaffe in most categories and superiority in specific areas like ground attack. He warned that assuming Soviet technological inferiority was dangerous and that German planning needed to account for an adversary capable of innovation and long-term strategic thinking. The report was received with skepticism, by some senior Luftwaffe officers who couldn't reconcile Soviet capabilities with their preconceptions about Slavic inferiority. But others, particularly those with recent combat experience on the Eastern Front, recognized the truth in Weiss's analysis. The pilots who faced Soviet aircraft daily knew that the enemy was becoming more dangerous, not less, as the war progressed. Major Erich Hartmann, the Luftwaffe's highest-scoring ace with over 300 victories, was interviewed as part of Weiss's research. Hartmann had spent years fighting over the Eastern Front and had engaged every type of Soviet aircraft in service. His assessment was blunt and professional. The early war Soviets were poorly trained and flew inferior aircraft. By 1944, that's no longer true. Their pilots have learned. Their aircraft have improved. The numerical advantage they've always had is now backed by genuine capability. We're not fighting the same enemy we faced in 1941. Hartmann specifically mentioned the IL-2 as an example of Soviet effectiveness. Shooting down a Sturmovik requires significant ammunition expenditure. The armor absorbs damage that would destroy other aircraft. If you don't hit the engine or the pilot directly, the aircraft often survives. I've watched IL-2s take hits that should be fatal and continue their attack runs. It's demoralizing for our ground forces and demonstrates a level of design competence we didn't credit the Soviets with initially.